Okay, well, hello everybody. Like I said, my name is Mary Beth. She, her pronouns. I'm the Community Education and Outreach Manager at Women's Advocates. And today we're going to talk about resistive violence and what that means and how to support victim survivors. Before we get into it, a quick note about Women's Advocates. Women's Advocates is a nonprofit organization in St. Paul, Minnesota, where we've just now gotten to see more more asphalt than snow. Um, we offer a continuum of safety through prevention programming like these webinars, emergency shelter and advocacy services, and housing stability services for victim survivors of domestic violence. We started out in the early 1970s as a legal advice helpline, helping women who were seeking divorce. We've been at it for almost 50 years, and during that time, we've expanded our shelter from one house to 3 houses, and we've updated our mission statement to better reflect what it is we do, which is walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. Women's Advocates work takes place on Dakota land. The area that is now St. Paul was stolen from the Dakota people by the American government through centuries of wars, broken treaties, and acts of cultural genocide. Through incredible perseverance and resistance, the Dakota are still here and strong. Native women and girls face the highest risk of domestic violence, sexual assault, and intimate partner homicide. We express our gratitude for the Indigenous-led organizations who are working each day towards a world without domestic and sexual violence. And as an organization, we commit ourselves to supporting tribal sovereignty with the same fervor that we support the self-sovereignty of victim survivors. You can read our full land acknowledgement at that link in the chat. All right, starting quickly with a poll just to see where you're all coming from. I'm looking at the chat. It's looking like we have quite a few Army and military personnel here. I'm interested to see exactly how many. And if you want to tell me how you found out about us and how what brings you to Women's Advocates webinars, I would love to find out. But today, we have a shorter amount of time with each other than normal. We're going to try to cram a lot into this next hour. So in the next 60 minutes, instead of 90, we are going to talk about what is resistive violence? What does that mean? We'll look at some case examples. In part 2, we'll talk about how resistive violence happens and how it is very rarely the first thing that a victim survivor does. And then in part 3, we are going to go into advocacy considerations. So thinking about how your program or your organization can better serve victim survivors who have used resistive violence against an abusive partner. Please take care of yourselves. Again, this is a webinar. We will send you the recording. It will be up on YouTube, so you don't have to worry that you're going to miss anything if you step away. This could be really difficult topics for some of us. Everybody's impacted differently by engaging with domestic violence material, so just take care of yourselves and know you won't miss a thing. If you have questions, comments, concerns, use the chat or put them in the Q&A, and I'll get to them as I can see them. But let me look at this poll real quick. Share the results with you all. Okay, we have a good group who participated in the poll. Thank you for doing so. It looks like we're pretty evenly split between victim survivors, advocates at domestic violence programs, or law enforcement and military personnel, with a couple of other providers peppered in for spice. So thank you all for being here, no matter where you come from, what you're doing. So glad that you're here. Let's get into it, shall we? What's resistive violence? Very quickly, just rehashing what domestic violence is and is not. If you have been to a Women's Advocates webinar before, you have seen this slide, but we conceptualize domestic violence as not just a one-time thing. It's not just somebody throws a remote or punches a hole in the drywall or hits their partner one time. Domestic violence is a pattern. It's a 24/7 pattern. It's not that one single incident. It is a pattern designed to exert control over another person, to exercise power in a way that makes the other person feel small and afraid and unsafe all of the time. It involves using a slew of different tactics like coercion, isolation, emotional abuse to make that other person's world smaller and more hostile. Um, and it's perpetrated by somebody that the victim survivor knows intimately, or who knows the victim survivor intimately. Doesn't have to just be a married partner or a spouse. It can be dating partners, people who have children in common, roommates, parents, anybody who has that close, intimate relationship with the victim survivor. Because what makes domestic violence different from stranger assaults, from crimes perpetrated by a stranger, is that abusers know the target of their abuse in a very intimate and personal way. They know the victim survivor's insecurities and fears. They know what makes them embarrassed. They know what they love and also what they fear. And they can leverage all of that information to harm the target in really subtle ways that a stranger just wouldn't have, using tools that a stranger just wouldn't have available to them to commit harm. So that's what domestic violence is. But we also know that victim survivors of domestic violence get charged with crimes. They get charged with crimes all the time. There's this prevailing understanding that, like, oh, if you're a victim survivor of abuse, like, you're not the one that's going to get in trouble or charged if you call the cops. Your abuser will. And that's a big old myth, unfortunately. Victim survivors of domestic violence are heavily criminalized. And there are some studies out there that have found out that over 90% of women who have been incarcerated in our nation's prison system have experiences of domestic or sexual violence perpetrated against them. So a good chunk of the incarcerated women in this country are victim survivors who have been criminalized, often directly as a result of their abuse. And there are lots of reasons that victims of domestic violence can be charged with crimes. There's a program that I will always be referring to you to called the Battered Women's Justice Project that does a lot of really good work with criminalized survivors. And their executive director, Cindine Pazel, says that most of the things abusers do to abuse are perfectly legal. It's not illegal to tell somebody what to wear or how late to stay out. But most of the ways victims attempt to survive abuse are criminalized, are illegal. So there are a couple of different ways that victim survivors commonly get charged with crimes or criminalized. The one that we're going to talk about in depth today is when a survivor has defended themselves or their children against an abuser's violence and has been charged with assault or homicide. That's the one we're going to talk about today. But there are a couple of other ways that victim survivors are criminalized. They can be charged with failure to protect their children from an abuser. If they do protect their children from the abuser by fleeing, they could get charged with kidnapping or custodial interference for leaving to protect their children. So you're incarcerated or criminalized if you don't protect your children, but also you're criminalized if you do. And then some survivors have been coerced by their abusers into assisting with an abuser's criminal activity or aiding and abetting the abuser's criminal activity. Like I said, we're only going to focus on that first bullet point during this webinar because we do not have as much time to get into all of it. But Other information is available in the very excellent webinar series, When Victims of Battering Are Charged with Crimes, from the Defense Center for Criminalized Survivors. There's a link at the bottom of this page that when you get the PowerPoint slides, you can click that and it goes directly to that webinar series where you can learn more. Okay, so before we get into what is resistive violence, it's really important to know that context is everything here. Not all violence between intimate partners is the same. Like I said, it's not just that one time, domestic violence isn't just that one time thing, it's a pattern. So not all violence between intimate partners is the same, and not all violence between intimate partners is domestic violence. It's also important to know that not everybody who uses violence against an intimate partner is an abuser. But Mary Beth, how do we tell? How do you know that this person is an abuser or not? Well, there are a lot of questions that you can ask to determine context. Your program might have really specific requirements about who can and can't be supported by your program. And those requirements might appear to exclude survivors who have been arrested for crimes against another person. So in order to open your practice or your program to as many survivors as you can, it's really important to establish some context when you're meeting with those prospective participants to kind of dig past the surface instead of immediately dismissing somebody who tells you, yes, I'm in jail because I hit my partner. You have to ask some questions. So these questions that you can ask to help establish context and determine whether that act of violence was domestic violence or not, you can ask questions like, is this behavior part of an ongoing pattern? Is it a one-time thing, or is it part of a pattern? Is this pattern intended to instill fear? And is this pattern linked to domination and control? Those should be your three checklists before determining, like if you get a call from a jail and a victim survivor who is in the jail says, I need help, I've been arrested for hitting or assaulting my abuser. You might think on the surface, oh, we can't work with this person because they're in jail for assaulting somebody and they're an abuser. No. What you need to do is ask this person some more questions, get some more information to find out, is that act of I hit my abuser a one-time thing or part of a pattern? Were they intending to intimidate their abuser or the person they hit? Were they intending to exert power and control over the person? That's how you find out in those unclear cases, whether abuse has been committed by this person that you are trying to assist. So, resistive violence, what is it? It's also called reactive violence. You'll hear those terms interchangeably. And it is when a victim survivor employs violence, like hits back in order to escape an abuser's use of violence, or survive an abuser's use of violence, or end that use of violence. Ellen Pence, who put together the power and control wheel that we saw a couple slides ago, said it best when she said, victim survivors often retaliate and resist domination and battering by using force themselves. And that's what resistive violence is. It is an attempt to try and get some of that power back that's been taken away from them over the course of an abusive relationship. It's a way that victim survivors try to keep the abuse from escalating, or try to say, hey, this is not okay. You need to stop this. There are two big old characteristics that distinguish resistive violence from regular, degular domestic assault. So the first characteristic of resistive violence is that it has a specific target, and that is the abuser. The specific target of resistive violence is always going to be the other violent person or the more violent person in the relationship. And it has a specific goal. Resistive violence is not a, hey, I want to just do this for funsies, or I'm trying to control my partner. Resistive violence has the specific goal of stopping the abuse or escaping the abuse. Victim survivors consider resistive violence as a form of self-protection. And it's often used in kind of a last-ditch effort to reclaim and restore the integrity that an abuser has systematically destroyed over the course of the relationship. So that motivation is really key. Like if the victim survivor has a motivation in using violence to stop violence that is actively occurring against them, it's resistive violence. We do have some case studies here. The general public tends to hear about resistive violence in the most sensational cases, the ones where a victim of abuse kills their abuser in retaliation or in self-defense. Those are typically what the general public hears about when they hear about resistive violence cases. And these cases go all the way back. For those who were in this movement at the very beginning, you probably heard of Francine Hughes, whose case against her abuser inspired a Burning Bed TV movie with Farrah Fawcett. But there are other cases as well. There's Kim Dedew Brown, who was sentenced to let's see, she was sentenced to almost 20 years for shooting and killing her boyfriend when he attempted to strangle her in 1991. But you also may have recently heard of Cyntoia Brown and Crystal Kaiser. Cyntoia Brown was sentenced in 2004 to life in prison for killing a man when she was 16 years old. And she was granted clemency by the governor of Tennessee after she appealed her sentence with her lawyers and claimed that she was a victim of sex trafficking by the person she killed, and she feared for her life. She is out of prison now on clemency and will remain on supervised parole for 10 years. But there's also Crystal Kaiser, who's another more recent case of resistive violence. Crystal Kaiser is 22. She is currently awaiting trial in Wisconsin on first-degree intentional homicide. The prosecutors say she shot and killed a man when she was 17. Crystal Kaiser does not deny that, but she says she met the man she killed when she was 16 and that he sexually abused her multiple times. And she is currently trying to use a legal defense under Wisconsin law that allows trafficking victims to have what's called an affirmative defense for any crime committed as a direct result of being trafficked. So those are some sex trafficking cases of resistive violence, but there's also Nicole Adimondo, who was convicted in 2018 of killing her partner. On the day before she killed her partner, she had been visited by Child Protective Services because Child Protective Services found out that her partner had been abusing her. And her partner responded to this threat by loading his handgun in front of her, showing her descriptions on his phone of how he could shoot her in her sleep, make it appear to be a suicide. And she shot him before he could do that. Her sentence is currently under review to potentially be appealed under an act that would require the judge to consider her experience of ongoing abuse that led to this act of violence. You can watch a really great documentary if you click the link at the bottom of this slide. The documentary is called And So I Stayed, and it profiles three women: Nicole Adamando, Kim Dedew Brown, and Tiffany Jones, three women who were convicted of killing their abusers in self-defense. It's a really great documentary. It's very powerful. I would highly recommend that you watch it if you have the time. You might think that victim survivors who assault or kill their abusers have a pretty easy case of self-defense, right? Like for Kim Dedew Brown, you would think, oh, well, he was actively strangling her. Of course, this was self-defense. She was going to die. Or, oh, Nicole Adamando's partner loaded a gun in front of her and said he was going to kill her. Of course, this is self-defense. She was going to die. Unfortunately, women are very often not given the benefit of the doubt when it comes to self-defense laws. There's a lot of gender bias in who gets acquitted on the basis of self-defense. In some states, women are 20% more likely than men to lose self-defense hearings or lose their self-defense case. More men have, in cases where stand your ground laws apply, more men have their stand your ground or self-defense standings approved in court than women. And there's a lot of gender disparity in how long people are sentenced for murder. I'm going to launch a poll here real quick because I want to know, does your state or territory have any laws or any stipulations that allow victim survivors to say, hey, I was abused, this is why this happened, when facing trial or sentencing? I would love to know. So going back to all of the gender disparities, the average sentence for men in this country who kill a female partner is 2 to 6 years. The average man who kills a female intimate partner walks out of prison 4 years after being convicted of that murder. The average sentence for women who kill their male partner is 15 years. Same crime, almost 3 times as long of a prison sentence. And fun, awful fact, men serve, on average, more time in prison for killing a stranger than they do if the person they killed was an intimate partner. That's nationwide. Men who kill a stranger serve more time in prison than men who kill an intimate partner. I'm not saying that everybody should be like, I'm not saying that some murders should be more important than others, but I am saying it's a little messed up that close, intimate relationship results in less prison time. So yeah, men serve less time in jail for killing a woman. The average prison sentence for men who kill female partners is 2 to 6 years. The average sentence for women who kill male partners is 15 years. Even though most women who kill their male partners do so in self-defense. I think that's messed up. I think we should be taking a look at why that is. There is a law that has been passed in New York called the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act that allows for victim survivors to have their experiences of abuse taken into consideration during sentencing. So if they are convicted of killing an abuser, the judge has the right to review their experience of abuse and say, based on your experience, I can give you a lighter sentence. So that is neat. We should be doing that. It looks like sharing results. It looks like a good chunk of people know that their state does have laws like this Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. That's great. If you're not sure, I would super encourage you to look up those laws because you never know when somebody you work with is going to need them. So yeah, I think it should be a nationwide law too. Person in the chat, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about the dynamics of resistive violence and how exactly it happens. We do know that resistive violence doesn't tend to happen as often in relationships where the abusive partner is only physically violent, but not otherwise controlling or abusive. Survivors are much more likely to use resistive violence when they are experiencing not only physical abuse, but coercive control, those deep controlling and regulatory behaviors. So a couple of quick things to recognize. One, victim survivors are going to resist abuse and poor treatment. Whenever people are treated badly on a recurring basis, they do resist. That resistance might take a different shape than we'd expect, but it does happen. Number two, when victim survivors resist abuse, they do it subtly. People tend not to notice. To an outsider, it might appear like the victim survivor is being passive or not standing up for themselves or not trying, but they are. They're actively trying, and they're doing it quietly because leaving is less of an event and more of a process. And then finally, number three, abusers know that resistance happens, so they try to stop that. Some survivors will resist abuse by just leaving the house, and so abusers will take their shoes, take their money, take their bank cards and car keys to stop them from leaving the house. Or they'll pull the phone out of the wall to prevent calling for help. Abusers know that victim survivors will resist, so they do what they can to make resistance impossible. All right, we've got those three foundational statements. Let's talk more. It's really important to know that violence is very rarely the first tool that a victim survivor uses in response to abuse by a partner. Usually coping comes first. They're not going to come out swinging immediately. They're going to try to cope first. And coping looks like this. They say yes to anything. They say yes to all demands. They try to keep the abuser pleased or in a good mood in order to prevent violence from happening. They say stuff like, "You're right, whatever you say, I'm fine." But they think something different. They think, "This is messed up. This is wrong. I don't deserve this. This isn't okay." Coping only works for so long because first, it becomes impossible to keep up with an abuser's ever increasing demands. And oftentimes survivors find that anything they do or say is going to result in abuse, no matter what. So they do their best to cope. They dissociate, they create emotional distance between themselves and their abuser. They shut down. They say things like, "Okay, fine, whatever you want, fine." But again, that doesn't work all the time. When coping burns out, because it does, because eventually you can only cope with so much, they attempt to manage. So they do a lot of work. Victim survivors will attune themselves like a fine radio dial to the abuser's moods. They will walk on eggshells. They'll change their lives entirely and change their routines to try to avoid causing an abuser's anger. Even though we know that the only person who causes an abuser's anger is the abuser, but they'll try their best anyway to avoid tripping that wire. They radically change their behavior, and their full-time job becomes making sure this person doesn't hit me. And that can't go on forever. It's freaking exhausting to try and do that for your entire life. It's exhausting. All of this work to manage, to respond to abuse with kindness, to blame themselves, to always be cleaning up after the abuser's messy parenting or abusive parenting. That's exhausting. That turns victim survivors into a shell of themselves. And again, survivors have no control over whether or not they're abused. None of these tactics are going to work long term because the abuser makes that choice. And no amount of managing can unmake that choice. And finally, when survivors are at their breaking point, when they can't cope or manage anymore, or when the violence is too extreme, or when it threatens their children, they resist. But even resistance is not just resistive violence. There is an escalation of tactics that leads to resistive violence. Even when they resist, they're not trying to come out swinging right away. So ways survivors resist is by at first just threatening to leave the relationship. They say, all right, you do this again, I'm out, which sometimes works, but oftentimes just makes the abuser try and grab a firmer hold. Then they request outside help, which we all know is so hard to do and incredibly brave. They reach out to their family, their friends, they reach out to police and clergy to say, hey, this is happening to me. My partner is doing this and I need it to stop. So they get that outside help. If that doesn't work, if that doesn't make things stop, make the abuse stop, they threaten to tell other people. They say, okay, you're going to do this. Well, I'm not hiding it. I'm not cleaning up after you anymore. I'm going to tell people what you did. To shame the offender, shame the abuser, into ending the abuse. That also doesn't always work. And if it doesn't, then they'll move into threatening consequences. So threatening to hurt the offender emotionally or economically, damage their property. Those sorts of threats that aren't threats of physical violence against the abuser themselves. And it's only after those consequences, threatening those consequences, doesn't result in the abuse ending. It's only then when resistive violence happens, when survivors will use physical violence back. And usually they don't throw the first punch or the first hit or whatever. It is often a classic self-defense scenario. So usually if a survivor is arrested or charged with physically harming a partner, it's very likely that it was the culmination of a series of failed attempts to placate or manage the abuser. It's really likely that the survivor tried all of these other methods unsuccessfully for a period of months or even years leading up to this point. It is only after a survivor has tried everything else that they can try that they resort to resistive violence. It's not people's first choice of tools to deploy. They burn through every other possible tool before going to that one. But when resistive violence happens, and especially when victim survivors are criminally charged as a result of that act of self-preservation, it creates a whole series of long-term impacts that negatively affect the survivor and also the rest of their family. Victim survivors who use resistive violence suddenly and get arrested for it suddenly find themselves caught up in a system that treats them as a perpetrator and discounts the harm that they've experienced. They often face custody challenges as a result of their experience of arrest and potentially incarceration. And they are further tied to their abuser by this experience. The process of being charged with and convicted of a crime is we say we have a right to a speedy trial in this country, but it can get pretty drawn out. So they continue being tied to their abuser for quite some time. And many victims who are charged with crimes experience ongoing and often increased coercion by their abuser or the abuser's family, like threatening to use their probation status against them or make police reports or child welfare reports if they don't comply with the abuser's demands. And we also know that a criminal conviction and sometimes even an arrest alone can impact somebody's ability to achieve employment, housing, education, voting rights, rights to be on their own tribal lands if they are enrolled in a tribe. It can affect your immigration status, your parental rights, your ability to travel. All of that stuff gets thrown up in the air when a victim survivor is arrested for resistive violence or convicted of that kind of violence against their abuser. I also think it's really important to note that when a victim survivor is arrested for resistive violence, they end up navigating these really difficult thoughts like, does this make me an abuser? If I hit them back, if I hurt them to protect myself, does that mean I'm an abuser too? And they're not, of course, because they were just trying to survive. They're not trying to make their abuser feel small. They're trying to make their abuser not kill them. But those thoughts still exist. And I think it's really important to talk about the fact that victim survivors who use that resistive violence often are navigating some really complex thoughts and feelings that as advocates we should be available to help them process through. All right, let's talk about advocacy considerations when we're working with survivors who've used resistive violence. Advocacy matters in these situations because being arrested always makes a person's life worse. But before we do any of this talking, I think it's important to look inward and look at what our own programs do and allow us to do. So I have a couple questions for you about whether your organization is permitted to help victim survivors who have been criminally charged, whether victim defendants reach out to your organization, and whether your organization reaches out to them. Some funding sources, it can be really hard to do this work, to do this domestic violence work and do it with people who have been criminally charged. Because some funding sources place limits on the types of victim survivors that an organization can support. So it's really important to know whether your program is even allowed to assist victim survivors who have been criminally charged. It's also important to know, like, is our hotline getting calls from the local correctional center? Is our hotline permitted to receive calls from the local jail? Figuring out whether you are able to support victim survivors at your org who have been criminally charged is really important. And also victim defendants, victim survivors who have been charged with crimes need to know their legal rights in a case against their abuser. And they also might want to plan for their safety after they're released from custody. And so it's important that if we can, we offer that kind of support. I think it's important as we're looking into whether victims defendants reach out to us for help or whether we reach out to victims defendants. It's important to look inward and figure out, do we do that? And if you don't, maybe consider doing it. I don't know. Look at your funding guidelines and see if you're allowed to. And if you are allowed to engage with victim survivors who have been criminally charged, maybe start making some materials and some targeted outreach toward this population, because victim defendants exist in your community. Victim survivors who have been charged with crimes exist in your community and they need your help. All right, I'm ending this poll and sharing results. It looks like most of us don't know whether our organization is permitted to assist victim survivors who have been criminally charged. That is something to find out. If you are interested in finding out, the first place I would recommend you look is whoever writes your grants. They probably know. Most of us do have victim defendants who reach out to our organizations for help. That's great. And most of us don't have organizations that directly reach out to victims defendants through county jails or other outlets. So that's a good wake up call for us to maybe start figuring out how to do some of that outreach. Oh, if you're on mobile, you might be having a harder time seeing polls, but that's okay. That was our last poll for the day. Um, Moving forward, we've got a couple of recommendations for DV programs, for advocates, and for legal personnel who are working with victim defendants. For DV programs, for domestic violence shelters and community-based organizations, it's really important to, when we're working with victim survivors who've been criminally charged, to be curious and trauma informed and figure out seek to understand the relationship that the survivor was in and seek to really understand why, or at least learn why. You might never understand why, but you can at least hear why the survivor used violence, whether it was out of fear or desperation or the need to find control in the context of no control. If your program can, maybe consider hosting a Know Your Rights training for shelter residents to make sure they know what to do in case of an arrest, what to do in case of a conviction, what to do in case of being pulled over or detained by law enforcement, or if law enforcement were to come to their residence. It's really important that we give as many survivors as we can the tools that they need to engage with law enforcement in a way that's going to be safe for them. If you also can, if your program can and is interested, consider creating outreach materials to send to jails and prisons. There are, like I said, over 90% of the women who are incarcerated in this country have experiences of domestic violence or sexual assault. And so they are probably going to be in need of your services. It would be really important to send out some information to them to know that help is available and they can contact you. Other things you can do are create relationships with both your defense attorneys in your county and your prosecuting attorneys in the county. Create those relationships so that both sides of the courtroom know that your program exists and your services are available, because both sides of the courtroom are going to have victim survivors that they're working with and will need to know where to send them. And then also, if possible, if your program has the capacity to provide a courtroom accompaniment, please do. If you don't have the capacity, look into what you could do to expand that. Because being in a courtroom as a victim survivor can be traumatizing and confusing, and is often a new experience for people. So the more that you can do to provide that safe accompaniment to a court proceeding, the better it'll be for the victim survivor. Because we know that the court system and legal system can be re-traumatizing, and it's important for people to have a source of support close by. And then for advocates in domestic violence programs, it's important to help victim survivors know what to expect in court, like which door to go through, when to talk, what to say, where to sit, who's the judge. And as an advocate, you might already know this, you might already know that stuff. But if you don't, when you're working with a survivor and they ask you, what do I do in court? And you don't know, it's okay to say that you don't know. But what you need to do next is bring in a colleague or a friend who does know and can share that information with the survivor. It's also important to remember your role. You're probably not going to be providing legal advice as an advocate, and you said that is a lawyer's job. It's important if you're dealing with a survivor who's been charged with a crime. It's important as the advocate not to discuss details that lead up to the case, because that is the lawyer's job. And your state might have laws that allow the prosecution to subpoena you as an advocate, and you would never want to testify against a victim survivor that you've been working with. So just try to avoid that entirely. Another thing that you can do as an advocate for a victim survivor who's been charged with a crime is to safety plan around the possibility of arrest, not to scare them, but to remind the victim survivor that victims of domestic violence are more at risk of arrest than people who aren't victim survivors. So think about with them, if they're arrested, who will pay their bail? Who's their first call? Who's their one phone call? Do they have a lawyer already? What's the plan for childcare if they're arrested? Who can talk to their boss and say that you're going to miss some days? Again, we don't safety plan around this possibility to scare people, but to prepare people in case they need that support. And then thinking about the fact that these survivors are facing additional vulnerabilities. Not only are they up against the power and control of an abuser, but they're also facing the power of the system. And that's really overwhelming. So if you can, please provide some space to process those feelings. If you're an advocate, or a defense team member, or an expert witness, or an investigator, the Defense Center for Criminalized Survivors in St. Paul is here for you. It's available for you no matter where you are in the country. I have a slide that links to their information. So know that if you're an advocate, that program is available to support you and to support the survivor you're working with. And then finally, for legal personnel, for folks who work in courts, who work in law enforcement, who are judges and lawyers, it's important to expand your capacity. Know what victim survivors of domestic violence are up against so that you can provide services in a way that's trauma-informed. Also, if you're a legal systems person, make connections with domestic violence advocates in your area. Find out where the shelters are and where the legal services for survivors are, and contact them. Let them know who you are, make sure you know who they are, and develop relationships, because you're going to need them at some point. It's best to just do the groundwork now before you need it, than to need it and realize you don't know where to start. And then finally, share resources and information with your clients about domestic violence programs and services. Do not assume that somebody coming in with a domestic assault case or an order for protection has a domestic violence advocate. Don't assume like, oh, they're here for a domestic related thing. They've already got an advocate. They probably don't. They might not. So don't assume that they already have the information they need. It's better to get the same information twice than to get no information ever because somebody assumed you already had it. And then finally, very important for the community, for all of us, it's important to advocate for systemic change. Let's do that. We do this by getting connected. We learn our community's laws, figure out what efforts there are to change them or make them stronger. If you're in this field, meet other people who are doing the work and get informed. Meet with defense attorneys and prosecutors. Introduce your court colleagues to your advocate colleagues and start to create or enter a network that provides support to victim survivors. We can also get political, start or support efforts to craft legislation that protects victim survivors who've been criminally charged. Attend days at the Capitol. I think most of our Minnesota crowd is actually away at Domestic Violence Action Day right now. So go to days at the Capitol. Work with your state coalition to advocate for laws like that one in New York. And then finally, get loud, spread the word, please. Educate people about the difference between abuse and resistive violence, about the fact that not everybody who hurts an intimate partner is doing so to abuse them. Sometimes they're doing so to stop the abuse. Push for more trauma-informed practices and procedures in your courtroom, if you have a courtroom, or in your workplace. and share what you know with others because others need to know it. Um, Another link that I am going to include in these slides is that toolkit for systems advocacy that has a bunch of really great tips about changing the legal system. I'm going to answer a couple of questions now. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat or the Q&A. But before I get to those, I want to share with you this whole page of further reading and resources. There is so much to read about resistive violence. I did not have time to cover it all, but what I will say is there is one group of people who have covered resistive violence very well for a very long time, and that is the National Defense Center for Criminalized Survivors. You'll see about midway down the page is that webinar series called When Victims of Battering Are Charged with Crimes. Go now and take that webinar series. It's from 2018, but it holds up amazingly. Like it's been 5 years at this point, and that webinar series is still relevant and so good, so valuable. And Sandine has just amazing things to say about the work that they do over there. So take a look at this further reading list. Here are some good resources. Again, the Battered Women's Justice Project is one that you should look at. But if you are working with any survivor who has been charged with a crime or is anywhere in the court process as a defendant, you can reach out to the Defense Center for Criminalized Survivors. And now I'm going to recommend that you attend pop-up advocacy, but also fill out, if you're interested in our online survivor support group, please fill out the interest form for that. And I'll get to the certificate links and the download links now. But let me answer, we have one question in the chat, in the Q&A, so I'm, oh, and it's more of a comment. Some clients that go through mental manipulation, that the abuser will paint pretty pictures about how things will change, or they'll say, I'll do anything to get you to stay. Yeah, that's really common. A lot of abusers will say that they're going to change to keep the survivor from leaving. And after a while, if you say, I'm going to change, I'm going to change, I'm going to change, and then you don't, that might result in an escalation that leads to resistive violence. If you have additional questions, I would love to hear them. This was a pretty quick overview of resistive violence. There's so much more to cover, which is why I would recommend that you take that webinar series from the National Defense Center. But I am putting in the chat a link to copies of the slides, links to download the certificate of attendance, and links to watch our webinar recordings, check out upcoming events, and subscribe to our YouTube page. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to stop recording now.